You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thanks for joining Revolution 250, where we look at events that took place 250 years ago this week. This is from the American Revolution Podcast, a short bonus episode to remind you about these important anniversaries of the Revolutionary War. This week, we remember the arrival of Henry Knox's noble train of artillery on January 24th, 1776. If George Washington ever hoped to end the siege of Boston, he was going to need more artillery. To that end, he turned to a young volunteer, Henry Knox. Knox always seemed like a really improbable choice. The guy was 25 years old, overweight, missing a couple of fingers on one hand from a shooting accident, and had never served in combat. He had dropped out of school at age 9 after his father's business failed. His father left the family and took off for the Caribbean, never to be seen again. As an adult, Henry had run a Boston bookstore, which had been a popular hangout for British officers during the occupation. He was also married to the daughter of a prominent loyalist. After Lexington, Knox and his wife Lucy slipped out of Boston. Knox did not join the Patriot Army with a formal enlistment or a commission. Rather, he served as a sort of civilian advisor, helping out with the defenses around Roxbury. When George Washington arrived, Knox apparently impressed the new commander with his book knowledge of artillery and military strategy. The two men dined together on several occasions, sometimes with Lucy present as well. Perhaps the fact that both men were Freemasons may have helped. Knox was also well connected. He was good friends with General Nathaniel Greene, as well as John Adams and a number of other influential patriots. They all endorsed Knox as a competent and dedicated patriot. In November 1775, under Washington's orders, Knox set out in search of cannons. He was not yet officially commissioned an officer, as that would require an act of Congress, but little things like that didn't seem to bother anyone. Washington gave him a command and $1,000 to collect artillery for use against the city of Boston. Knox first set out for New York City, where he met with former Patriot agitator and now militia colonel Alexander McDougal. Knox tried to acquire some of the New York artillery for use in Boston. McDougal offered a few smaller pieces, but he was unwilling to part with the larger guns that he wanted to use in New York. Unsatisfied with that, Knox traveled to Fort Ticonderoga to collect what he could get there. You may recall that the Patriots had captured about 200 pieces when they took Ticonderoga and the surrounding forts, but only about half of those guns were serviceable, and some of that serviceable field artillery had gone up to support the efforts to take Quebec. So Knox had to pick from among the pieces that were left. Based on a letter from Washington, General Schuyler gave Knox the Ticonderoga artillery. Knox selected 59 pieces, 43 heavy cannon, 6 cohorns, 8 mortars, and 2 howitzers. In total, he had about 60 tons worth of weaponry to drag back to Boston. The largest pieces weighed as much as 5,000 pounds. Knox optimistically thought he could drag all this equipment 300 miles across lakes, over mountains, in a little over 2 weeks. But it would not be that easy. In early December, he set out on the first leg, moving guns by boat down Lake Champlain to Fort George. One of the boats, commanded by his brother, hit a rock and sank. Fortunately, all the men survived, and they salvaged the equipment, but just getting the equipment to Fort George took until December 15th. By this time, the temperature had fallen below freezing. Knox could no longer use boats to move his guns down the river. Instead, he would have to use sleds to carry the guns along the banks of the Hudson, over the ice and snow, to below Albany, and then across Massachusetts. Now, there were 2 problems with that plan. 1, he had no sleds, and 2, there was no ice and snow. December 1775 in inland New York was unusually warm and dry, without enough snow to pull the sleds overland. By Christmas Eve, the region finally saw a decent snowfall, but the party still did not have enough sleds. General Schuyler had fired the military contractor who was building the sleds because the contractor wanted too much money. They found other local carpenters to assemble 42 sleds to carry the guns. He then scoured the area for animals and teamsters to drive the sleds. Knox had hoped to use oxen to pull the heavy equipment, but he could not find enough of them. He would have to use horses for many of his sleds. By January, there was snow, but too much snow. Drifts of 2 to 3 feet made it nearly impossible for the horses to make much headway. Some days they could only travel a few miles. They had additional problems with river crossings. Their route would require crossing the Hudson River multiple times. As the train progressed, Knox decided to leave his men on their own. Knox was not a hardened military officer. He enjoyed good company in a warm home rather than sitting in a cold, miserable tent at night. He had his men continue on their own and rode off to spend the evening with General Schuyler. While the two were having dinner, a messenger reported that one of the largest cannons had broken through the ice and was sitting at the bottom of the Hudson River near Albany, New York. With that, Knox returned to the train, directly supervising the movement of the remaining guns across the river. Rather than abandon the lost cannon, Knox recruited locals from Albany to help recover the gun. There are not a lot of specifics about how they did it, but somehow they got ropes around the drowned cannon and pulled it out of the river and onto a new sled. And thanks to the people of Albany, Knox christened the cannon the Albany, a name that it would use for the remainder of its service in the war. After this incident, Knox stayed with the train for most of the rest of the journey to ensure no more problems. The team managed to get the guns over the mountains of western Massachusetts. Knox made no attempt to keep his mission a secret. Instead, he showed off the weapons to interested crowds in the towns and villages that he passed along the way. Friendly locals often provided food and shelter for his men as they made the difficult journey. At Westfield, he reportedly fired one of the larger guns just to impress the locals. He hit his next challenge at Springfield when his train reached the Connecticut River. The New Yorkers that he had hired to bring the guns that far were exhausted and wanted to go home. They had only agreed to go as far as Springfield, and they were ready to be done. It had gotten warm again, most of the snow melted, and the sleds would not work. Knox had to pay off his men and wait for the weather to change again. A few days later it did. Now that they were in central Massachusetts, there were plenty of friendly locals willing to help continue the mission. Knox was able to hire a new crew of Massachusetts men, along with new teams of oxen to carry the guns the rest of the way. As the train got closer to Cambridge, Knox once again abandoned his team and rode ahead. By now at least they had passed over all the most difficult hurdles. He arrived in Cambridge on January 24th to inform Washington that the guns would soon be available for use. He also learned that Congress had granted him a commission as a colonel in the Continental Army. The next day the train arrived in Framingham. There, John Adams and Elbridge Gerry inspected the guns along with other locals who were excited to see the new force of artillery that would soon be pointed at the regular army in Boston. A few days later, on January 27, 1776, the noble train, as Knox called it, finally arrived in Cambridge, making Knox the toast of the army. Knox had proven himself to be a capable leader of men, not yet in combat, but at least as a logistical officer. It had taken him nearly 6 weeks to get the artillery back to Cambridge, far longer than the 2.5 weeks that he had planned. Even so, everyone hailed the mission as a great success. He even brought in the expedition under budget and could return some of the advance money that he had taken for the mission. Over the next few weeks, Colonel Knox would oversee the employment of his new guns in Roxbury and other areas around Boston, and he would take command of the Continental Army's artillery regiment. I hope you've enjoyed this Revolution 250 moment. Please subscribe for free on whatever podcast platform you like. Again, thanks for listening to this Revolution 250 moment on the American Revolution podcast.